Sweden has one of the most surprising legacies in tabletop role-playing games. While the rest of the world grew up playing with Dungeons & Dragons, Sweden built its own empire with Drakar och Demoner, Mutant, Western, Eon, and a whole other ecosystem that was entirely in Swedish long before any English imports arrived. Today, Swedish creators and their Nordic neighbors are reshaping the global RPG scene with some of the most atmospheric and innovative games on the market. Let's explore how a small cluster of countries in the north took tabletop gaming outside the box, and how they quietly took over the scene and are now one of the top producers of the modern-day TTRPGs. Hi everyone, my name is Lee, and thanks for joining us on another video today into the culture of TTRPGs. So it all started in 1982 with Drakar och Demoner, which translates to Dragons and Demons. This was the first big homegrown Swedish RPG published by a company called Äventyrsspel, later known as Target Games. Sorry for butchering the Swedish, it's a very tough language. First, let's talk a little bit about Fredrik Malmberg. Malmberg was one of the founders of Target Games / Äventyrsspel, and he ended up in an extended stay in the US where he worked with / around American game publishers and was able to play test early Chaosium products like Call of Cthulhu. That directly exposed him to the basic role-playing mechanics, aka BRP, and the emerging scene that was happening in the US with Dungeons & Dragons and stuff coming out in the late 70s. So the US contact that Malmberg had is often cited as decisive in his decision to create a Swedish language RPG built on the basic role-playing mechanics rather than translating D&D into Swedish. Malmberg considered the BRP approach more modern and better suited to Swedish readers than the heavier, more opaque early D&D rules, and that the language barrier would make an original Swedish product much more viable and more commercially available to be in toy shops and in bookstores. This local first approach really helped the game become massively popular in Sweden.
Was that we created games which were explicitly designed for the Swedish cultural, popular culture.
So during the 80s, Target Games quickly became like the central Swedish tabletop brand. They had Drakar och Demoner in 1982, and 2 years later they released the second edition, which was the Black Box edition. They had a bunch of supplements for it as well, like Ivanhoe, and there was a ninja supplement called Samurai. And in 1994 as well, they also released a game called Mutant, which is a post-apocalyptic game, which also became very, very popular, had many modules and adventures, and there was a sequel called Mutant 2, and Mutant 2089, which was inspired by the cyberpunk wave at that time. And Äventyrsspel also licensed other games as well, not only publishing their own, but they had games like the Lord of the Rings RPG, the Middle-earth role-playing game, there was a Star Wars RPG, and there was also a game called Shock, which was a translation of the English language game Chill, which was like a American horror movie type role-playing game. In addition to all of these games that they published, Äventyrsspel also had miniatures and war games, and even had a magazine that they published called Cinco Dus that was mostly about tabletop role-playing games. Target Games expanded into many different lines, including Cult, which later sparked a moral panic, and then eventually folded and went bankrupt in 1999. A lot of the IPs changed hands into Paradox Entertainment, and then more recently Cabinet Entertainment, and in recent decades Free League or Freeligen and other publishers have revived or reinterpreted some of these classic Swedish games, like a new English language version of Drakar och Demoner, which is now called Dragonbane. Even the Western genre found a home in Sweden with the simply titled game Western, which was originally released in 1989 and remains one of the country's more popular convention games and one of the more detailed Western RPGs out there. Even all the way back in 1977, there has even been an annual convention for the tabletop hobby in Sweden. Originally it was just called Convent, but in 1980 the name was changed to GothCon, since the convention is held in the city of Gothenburg. Apparently the story is that the organizer was putting in an ad for Convent with the White Wolf magazine, and on the phone he was asked for a name of the convention, And when he said convent, I think it wasn't very convincing that it was like a proper convention, and so he just said Gothcon, and it has stuck ever since. One of the most unique parts of Sweden's tabletop story is that the growth of the hobby can also be attributed to the centralization and the creation of official clubs across the country. Unlike in many countries where gaming clubs are small and scattered and even potentially frowned upon, Sweden had a government-backed infrastructure that actively encouraged young people to explore new hobbies, including fantasy role-playing games. If you're in Sweden and if you're young and you want to start a club for almost anything, like painting, robotics, music, tabletop RPGs, you just need to get like 10 people together, apply for state funding, and you'll get it. This created a whole ecosystem of local gaming groups across the entire country. So even if you lived in a really rural area and you weren't close to any of the big cities, you weren't isolated from the hobby and other people in the hobby. You still had access to the same kind of organized play communities. They were all organized and connected through a central youth organization that linked them together and helped distribute resources, provided funding, and they taught kids how to run meetings and manage budgets and operate as part of a larger national system. So instead of TTRPGs being like a secretive basement hobby, they became something that was more official and recognized. The organization is called SVEROK, aka the Swedish Gaming Federation, and it was founded in 1988 and included everything from board games, miniature gaming, card games, role-playing games, video games, LARPing, and they did something that was incredibly important during the 1980s and the early 90s as well, when Sweden faced its own version of the Satanic Panic. In 1991, Target Games released Kult, a horror RPG about reality being an illusion that's hiding divine imprisonment and torture. It was philosophical and disturbing and very sensationally controversial. So similar to what happened in the 1980s with Dungeons and Dragons in the US, Kult was also linked to several Swedish moral panics during the 90s. At the time of the game's initial publications, role-playing games were still sold primarily in Sweden through toy stores rather than bookstores or in special hobby shops, so they were quite widely available to anyone who wanted to buy one. Kult appeared in the press several times during the decade after its publication, and in 1997, the core rules of Kult were quoted in an official motion from the Parliament of Sweden. This motion was to stop the taxpayer funding of these youth groups that were active with role-playing games. This refers to the Bjuv murder, where a 15-year-old in the small southern town of Bjuv was killed by two of his friends, aged 16 and 17, who, according to the legal motion, were influenced by the game Kult. Critics of role-playing games have also attempted to tie Kult to a suicide that happened in November 1996. The local newspaper Tonsberg Blad in Tonsberg, Norway, similarly also tried to link Kult to the disappearance of a boy in 1994 who had allegedly played Kult the week prior to his disappearance. While countries like the US and other places saw moral crusaders kind of pushing to ban games like D&D,
warning signs of satanic behavior may be apparent, such as a sudden, bitterly antagonistic attitude towards family and religion, a decorative dagger or knife, a personal diary with a black cover, which is called a Book of Shadows. If you discover items such as these, experts advise you contact your local law enforcement agency at once.
Sweden's Central Youth Organization defended the hobby publicly. They stepped in, they investigated claims, and they pushed back against the sensationalism and helped keep TTRPGs visible and legitimate and kind of squashed the moral panic probably faster than it would have otherwise. This meant two things. So first, the hobby didn't go underground like it did elsewhere, and second, Swedish players didn't grow up feeling the need to hide the fact that they were playing tabletop role-playing games. In Sweden, it was, and still totally is, normal to say, yeah, I'm playing in a role-playing campaign this weekend. You know, there's no need to hide the fact that you're a D&D player. By giving young people money, structure, and legitimacy, the Swedish government helped transform tabletop role-playing games from a niche pastime into a nationally recognized youth hobby. And this foundation really played a huge role in why Swedish TTRPG culture became one of the strongest and most innovative in the world. Compared to the high heroics of Dungeons and Dragons, early Swedish RPGs took a different approach. Instead of conquering kingdoms, characters just struggled to survive. Combat was dangerous, hit points were low, and the smartest move in pretty much any encounter was to negotiate or avoid conflict entirely. Swedish adventures really centered on the chosen heroes. They focused on ordinary people navigating harsh environments, making fragile alliances with the NPCs, and navigating through morally ambiguous situations. If American RPGs were about destiny and defeating the Dark Lord, Swedish ones were about endurance and navigating an oppressive world. So let's fast forward to the 2010s, and a new studio, Fria Ligan, or Free League, began revitalizing classic Swedish worlds with modern cinematic design. They transformed Mutant into Mutant Year Zero and, brought it back to life with a recent Kickstarter. They also now hold the license for Drakar och Demoner, and they've reintroduced it to the world as Dragonbane, and they've launched a lot of original titles that define the Nordic style for international players. Games like Tales from the Loop, Vaesen, and Forbidden Lands. So a lot of Free League titles all rely on the Year Zero engine, which is a really simple narrative-driven dice pool system that emphasizes tension, consequences, and story flow. It's not so much about combat as it is about the consequences of the choices that you're making. So this system powers games like the Alien RPG, Blade Runner, and it really pushes Swedish design into some of the biggest licensed games on the market. Free League also publishes a lot of great titles now, like the One Ring RPG that came out a couple years ago, and Mörkborg, the Walking Dead RPG, Into the Odd, The Electric State, and many, many other cool titles. While Sweden led much of the global push, the other Nordic countries also developed their own distinctive voices in the TTRPG industry. Finland produced Praedor, a gritty sword and sorcery RPG based on a long-running comic. They have Stalker, a post-Soviet survival game inspired by Roadside Picnic, and small experimental titles like Chernobyl Mon Amour and Bad Sex. Norway also contributed deeply to the atmospheric storytelling games such as Itrus By, which is a surreal dream city RPG powered by a card-based narrative system, and Draug, which places ordinary 19th century Norwegians face-to-face with trolls and folk spirits. Both emphasize collaboration and mood over combat. In Denmark, they gave us a game called Fusion, a 1990s urban occult noir about private detectives surviving a privatized dystopia, and Black Void, a sweeping cosmic horror epic set after humanity is flung across the stars. Even Iceland added its voice with Askir Yggdrasils, a 1994 game that was domestic to Iceland, built on sagas and rune magic. And there's also a game called Mythic Iceland, which was not written by a native Icelandic person, but a Brazilian who lived in Iceland for a little while, and it's like a Viking-era RPG. The Swedish indie boom brought even more experimentation to the scene. Mjölkiborg, or Mörkborg as we like to say, fused doom and gloom metal aesthetics with minimalist rules, presenting an apocalypse in neon yellow ink that is a beautiful collectible art book that should sit in everyone's shelves. Trudvang Chronicles drew from Norse and Celtic myth to create a lush watercolor forest that's full of spirits and sagas, and publishers like Riot Minds, Helmgast, and Järnringen, which is now part of Free League, developed ambitious dark fantasy worlds like Symbaroum, and Helmgast reinvented the controversial Cult into Cult Divinity Lost and turned it into a modern prestige horror RPG. So why did Sweden's RPG sector thrive? Firstly, infrastructure. The government-backed youth clubs really normalized gaming as a mainstream activity. These clubs offered meeting spaces, funding, and national organization, which gave even small towns a stable gaming ecosystem. Secondly, translation and early adoption were done quite differently in Sweden than in other places. Swedish publishers moved quickly to translate, adapt, and create RPGs in the late 70s and the early 80s for a Swedish audience. There's also a very strong reading culture and a collaborative teaching style from just the country in general that made the hobby a natural fit. Not only translations, but localizations of international games still keep the hobby alive. In 2019, a company called Eloso Förlag began a product to localize Call of Cthulhu into a Swedish setting, and there was a very successful Kickstarter for it in 2024. And thirdly, the cultural mood in Sweden was different. So Swedish fiction often explores isolation, moral ambiguity, and quiet melancholy, which is kind of the same atmosphere that you can find in Vaesen, Symbaroum, and even in Alien. This aesthetic really became a recognizable design export. In the last decade, Swedish designers have reshaped how the world thinks about rules light systems, atmospheric world building, and art-driven RPGs. The Year Zero engine from Free League has become one of the most recognizable narrative frameworks in modern tabletop gaming. Many of the trends that dominate TTRPG gaming also trace back to a lot of Swedish designs. Clean layout, cozy horror, folk mysteries, dice pool tension, and mood-first storytelling all have become global standards after Swedish games push them into the spotlight. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sure that there are a bunch of games that I wasn't able to cover in this video, and if you know of any other Nordic games that I didn't talk about or mention, please let us know in the comments. I always love learning about new games. Thank you to all of our dear patrons for watching, and if you like this video, if you want to see more videos like this, don't forget to give us a like and a subscribe if you are so inclined, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you, and goodbye. Mjorkiborgi. Mjorkiborgi. Markiborgi. Wait. Mjorkiborgi. Mjorkborgi. Mjorkiborgi.
This game, Hallmark Bog,